It's great to be here after a wonderful demonstration. It's part of, I think, what has been evolving across North America, a new anti-capitalist politics over the last number of years that have been reviving May Day, which started, of course, with the immigrant rights movement in 2005 in the US and spilled over into Canada, and has been continuing since. Of course, May Day, as we know, is the Workers' Day that began with the events in Haymarket in Chicago in the 1880s, which then soon turned into an International Workers' Day across the world. And it's always important at this time of year to acknowledge not only the struggles going on here, but also around the world. Here, of course, it's been what's been inspiring over the last number of months has been the amazing strike in Quebec law students, which has just been unbelievable in standing for a principle of decommodification or free education in this time period against neoliberalism. It was absolutely incredible. I think another key struggle over this year, which has been very inspiring across Canada, has been the Indigenous peoples of Canada fighting around the tar sands and the Northern Gateway pipeline in the face of what has been an unbelievably powerful capitalist class oriented to deepening oil production, in the face of all the evidence of greenhouse gases and global warming and so on. To stand by the Indigenous peoples has been remarkable. I think another one we should celebrate briefly is, of course, the long strike of workers of the United Steelworkers in Quebec at the mine has been amazing. The endurance, which has been typical of what have been very long strikes occurring in the private sector in key issues related to collective bargaining. These very long, difficult strikes that have been going on in the face of what has often turned out to be capital flight. So there's been a remarkable series of events. I think also we've been witnessing over the last year the resistance that has been occurring in Europe, especially around austerity, and the fight back that has occurred across the streets of the southern European countries, in particular Greece, but also Portugal, Spain over the last number of, the last year or several years in the case of Greece, and the last year or so in the case of Spain and Portugal, which I think alongside the Arab Spring has kind of shifted us into this new political moment across the world market and across the world, in fact, around issues related to resistance. And I want to speak about that context in particular and then begin focusing more on the particular dimensions of the austerity crisis. First of all, just to recall the crisis that has hit the advanced capitalist core in 2007 and is, in world history, the largest economic disaster ever. In terms of magnitude, it is looking like it'll be the largest economic disaster ever in terms of its duration. And it's quite astonishing, some of the numbers that occurred. I just want to give a couple of indications of that. And part of it has to do with the financialization that has gone along with neoliberalism. One needs to remember that in about 1980, total financial assets in the world relative to GDP were about 1 1/3. So in other words, financial assets and relative to GDP was about 1 1/3. By 2008, world GDP was about 60 trillion. And there was being traded in the derivatives market alone, this complex set of financial products, $600 trillion. In other words, just in that one market alone was 10 times the magnitude of real GDP. So in other words, there's a massive explosion of financial assets around the world. This led to some of the biggest bankruptcies in history. The largest corporate loss in a year was AIG of 60 billion, the largest industrial bankruptcy of General Motors, and so on and so forth. An astonishing range of economic dislocation. When we look at the one measure that we typically look at to get at the global magnitude, there was something like $40 trillion of assets wiped out between 2007 and 2009. The bailout packages that have been delivered by the various states in the advanced capitalist core are estimated at between $20 and $30 trillion. This is why, when we look at it, and why we're speaking about an economic disaster that's the largest, and why its magnitude was going to be dragged out over many years. This is the 5th stage of the crisis, which I just want to recall what those were. In 2007, we had the beginning of the popping of these large credit bubbles that had built up over the period of neoliberalism. The first thing that occurred was in late 2007. Some of the subprime mortgage rate markets started moving in. Some of the firms lending in those areas started moving into problems of solvency. This was particularly localized in Florida, parts of Los Angeles, Denver. Now, the problems of all of this credit change meant that it soon erupted across the financial system. And by 2008, 2009, we were into what was being called a global liquidity crisis, meaning banks were having a hard time borrowing from each other. They couldn't trust that they would be paid the next day. Money markets were seizing up. And so everybody was having a problem getting access to financial assets. What underpinned what was being called a global liquidity crisis was in fact a global insolvency crisis of the banking system. The banks had leverage to such an extent that most of them were insolvent once you slowed down the rate of economic growth. They were having a hard time then getting the interest payments and loan payment coming back, and so they started becoming they were effectively bankrupt. That was the 2nd stage. The 3rd stage was when this global liquidity, global insolvency crisis started occurring from 2009 to 2010. The world market as a whole started seizing up. When the world market as a whole started seizing up in this time period, we had what was the first time since the Great Depression, a collapse of world trade. It was negative world economic growth as a whole. So in other words, the biggest downturn since the Great Depression. This is why it's quite accurate to call this a Great Depression. And to some extent, in many figures, in many parts of the world, this is looking at as a Great Depression that was more severe than the Great Depression of the 1930s here. But it is clearly, by any measure, the 3rd Great Depression of capitalism. The 4th stage of the crisis was the movement of an attempt to try and get out of this through massive injections of liquidity into the banking system. Many of the bad loans being taken into the state doing different measures to recapitalize the banking system, fiscal stimulus measures. So in other words, there was an attempt to stabilize the economic system, and as part of that, take the problems of the private banking sector and shove them into the state. Okay? So in other words, the bad debt was brought into the state. This produced the 5th stage of the crisis that you're in now. This is the stage of what's often labeled the sovereign debt crisis or the austerity crisis, and that is the attempt now to have us as workers pay for the crisis. Right? So the long-term issue of austerity. I think this particular way the crisis unfolds leaves us with several important things to think about. One is the size and the duration by which this austerity fight is going to go on. It's not a short-term fight. The IMF and the World Bank initially in late 2009, 2010 started putting forward projections of calling for 10 to 20 years of austerity. This was matched by discussions by the Canadian banks that began putting out similar calls, and the Canadian government at various points of time have been also floating this. So this is something that's going to last for a very long time. The other thing that has occurred is that it's not clear whether this is going to disrupt or cause a fracture. It was often said that this would lead to a fracture between the U.S. and other parts of the zone or other parts of the world or between the U.S. and China. So far, in fact, it's been the opposite. the U.S. has remained central to dealing with the problems of the crisis. The U.S. has been the key component dealing with issues of coordination of how to solve the crisis. And there's become a deepening reciprocal relationship between China and the U.S. in dealing with a range of world market issues. The other thing I think it's important to account for, and that's what I'll turn to next, is that it does not look, and this is paradoxical to what most people were predicting, that this would be the end of neoliberalism or the policies of the hard right. In fact, the way that the crisis is unfolding, most of those policies of the political right have been deepening in the state sector. In other words, neoliberalism has gained an additional foothold. And I think it's had particular characteristics that are very, very important for us to think about. Particularly for those of us who think about democracy and socialism. And that's what I want to speak to now in terms of the form of the ruling class exit. A number of features are important, I think, to begin with, in that unlike other crises that have occurred in the phase of capitalism, this one has not divided the ruling classes. There has been no big split between the banking sector and industry. There's been no major split between small business and large business. They've remained relatively united. And what's remarkable is that financial capital, the banks in particular, have remained dominant in the power structures. They remain dominant across the state. They remain dominant in laying out what is the direction of economic policy. And nowhere in the advanced capitalist corridor we see a break occurring around that. Another important political calibration of this that's very, very difficult to us to confront. It's a major dilemma for us in Canada. It's a major dilemma in Europe and the US with the coming presidential election. In that social democracy and the social democratic parties have largely governed in a common ground with the parties of the right and backed austerity. The social democratic governments across Western Europe, when they've been in power, have implemented austerity. The social democratic governments in power in Canada have implemented austerity. Social democratic governments are not providing an alternative. And I think if we see what comes out of the coming elections in this weekend, in two different forms, the one in Greece, the social democratic government will try to form a common front government with the parties of the right to stabilize and come behind the austerity agenda in Greece. And Hollande, the likely winner of the French election, is likely to come behind a policy of a tactical difference with the Germans over the degree and form of austerity. But they are not going to break with it. I think another important component of this is, as I mentioned, is the role that the U.S. has been playing as a key coordinator of the world market and still remains the dominant node in the imperialist chain. It is still the dominant country setting global economic policy through control of the financial institutions, etc. The problems in Europe and Japan mean neither of those zones are capable of offering any alternative to the U.S. policy agenda. And the particular difficulties inside China and the reciprocal dependence upon the way China has developed and the class structures in China mean it is intertwined right now at the moment with the U.S. and is not offering an alternative agenda. Another feature of the exit and the way that this has been evolving in the state system is to think about the way that state policies have been restructured. The core of this has been the monetary policies of the central banks. With the financial crisis as it evolved from 2007 to 2008, we went to different emergency forms of monetary policy. Basically, as I mentioned, to take the debt that had been formed in the banks and find various ways to push that debt into the public sector. This means, in the different ways we look at it, was done to bolster the banks. is that central banks' balance sheets have gone up from 2 to 4 times what they were in 2007, 2008. Which essentially means is that all the debt that the banks had blown up in the credit bubbles had gone from their balance sheets and been put on the public sector balance sheets through the central banks. In other words, we socialized the debt. Okay? And this has been central to keeping the banks in place. This policy has not been able to be broken with yet because of the extent of the financialization through the world credit system, and also because of slow growth. So in other words, we remain locked into those forms of monetary policy dealing with the socialization or backstopping the bank lending. There was a wonderful policy paper released by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives this week, which nicely laid out the extent to which the federal government in Canada and the central bank in Canada is backstopping the Canadian banking system in the order of $200 billion. And that's the kind of why we have such a hugely different role for the CMHC, some of the other financial structures in the federal government. It's also why we have very low interest rates locked in for a long time period as well, because of the general weakness and the problems that we haven't been able, the capitalist classes have not been able to move away from an emergency monetary policy. Another dimension of this is financial deregulation. We have not seen substantial financial re-regulation. What's occurred through the major bills that occurred in Europe and through the international banking system, or the Dodd-Frank bill in the States, was essentially an attempt to stabilize, regularize, and increase transparency over the neoliberal forms of deregulation of finance that has occurred. It's not reversing them, it's just attempting to stabilize those structures. So in other words, there's been no reversal of the key social actor, the banking system and the rest of the financial system that's caused this disaster. There's been basically nothing done to them. And that is why you see kind of the reward systems, the bonus systems, their role in setting up economic policy still in place. Another dimension of this has been the tax system that's evolved, that has evolved since the crisis. There has been nothing at all anywhere resembling a crisis tax. That is, those people who caused the problem paying for it. In fact, we've largely had the reverse occur. We've had the reverse occur through corporate tax cuts at the same time as part of the imposition of austerity. And the shifting of what taxes have increased have tended to be different forms of consumption or sales taxes. You'll see some discussion, and we see in Ontario level there was just a negotiation over increasing some of the corporate taxes. Those increases in personal income taxes at the highest bracket, the so-called Buffett rule after Warren Buffett, are relatively marginal and mean less than what has occurred through the corporate tax cuts. So in effect, right, the capitalist classes are not paying for the crisis at all. That's the logic of the austerity being put in place. Another dimension of what's occurred has been the continual reorganization of the structures of the state. Usually what we see occurring is there's been the movement, and we see it during you can see it just how the layoff notices and all the rest of it, and the restructuring of the federal government has occurred, is that there's usually been a specialized economic apparatus or a very secretive component of the state that's hammered out how the austerity will be imposed and how the cuts will be imposed. This has been typical of what's occurred across all the advanced capitalist countries. Alongside that, there's been an increased use of increasing role on the coercive apparatuses, the security apparatuses, the policing apparatuses, the military and prisons apparatuses of the state. All those have been increasing. When we think about what's occurring there, the cutbacks to welfare, the cutbacks to social programs, a strengthening of the executive structures of the state, increasing emphasis on the coercive parts of the state. We see what is fundamentally evolving is an anti-democratic or authoritarian state structure. I'm not saying liberal democracy or electoral democracy is being eliminated, but there's particular features by which democracy is being limited and curtailed. And I'm just going to elaborate a couple of those. We have increased power of the executive relative to Parliament. Parliament's consistently being marginalized. Within the executive, we see an increasing concentration of the core in the executive that is setting the shots, not the wider executive. Within the core of the executive, we typically see different measures by which the capitalist classes are being directly inscribed into the state to lay out the economic policy of the state. That's partly through the use of specialized commissions. We saw a wonderful example of that in Ontario through the Drummond Commission, directly articulating a major figure of the Canadian capitalist class directly into the state system. And then through that is the direction of what economic policy was being established, and so on. This has been common across the advanced capitalist core states. You see a few additional dimensions of that. The core stability pact that is being put forward by the European Union in terms of austerity is an aspect of that, where they are attempting to constitutionalize balanced budgets in the treaty system and in constitutions. You see that in the federal government here through the cutting of the environmental committees. You know, all these kinds of things that would involve people being involved. Another example of that is the people here have been largely ignoring is the placing of Detroit and its budgetary system under special administrative rule over the last number of months. That means all budgetary processes in the city of Detroit are being put through a special raise about this is austerity. It's the sweep of austerity. Systematically, this is meaning a long period of cuts. These cuts are in the form of systematic forms of public sector layoffs, rollback and wage freezes of different kinds, pension cuts, and so on. As I mentioned, this is the strategy that's locked in place for 10 to 20 years. Okay? That's what we are confronting. The good part is, in response to that, we're also, I think, in a turning point in terms of the forms of resistance and political thinking that has occurred in response to this. You can see that across the world right now. After the initial waves of protests that occurred in 2007, 2008 in response to the economic crisis, where there was a lot of initial strikes, there was a pushback from the capitalist classes in a relative period of quiet responses. Since 2010, 2011, across the world, there's been an upsurge in a range of forms of resistances of all kinds. I'm going to wrap up with this point. Is you can see it, the most visible sign in North America, of course, has been the innovations of the Occupy movement over the last year. That Occupy movement has been important in a number of ways, and not just in itself, but the way that it's also articulated through the labor movement and pushed some new thinking and innovative strategies in the labor movement. It also is in the form of what's been called the movement across the U.S. that has occurred from a wide range of social organizations and a mass training that has occurred in and around civil disobedience and around social issues that have occurred. I think that is the new setting that we're also at politically, but we're against this very strong structures of austerity that the ruling class has consolidated in what is clearly a new authoritarian or anti-democratic stage of the crisis. Thank you.